Hello and welcome to Thinking Critically, a D&D discussion, a podcast where we deep dive single word concepts or ideas within the Dungeons & Dragons 5e framework. My name is Danilo, and I like all kinds of games and the crunchy mechanics that make him tick. You can find me on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram, and I'd really appreciate a like or a follow. And today, I'm joined by Bart Winance. Thank you ever so much, Bart, for joining me today. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Okay, hi everyone, my name is Bart Winance. I am a freelance RPG writer/designer from Antwerp, Belgium, which explains my accent a little, I suppose. I have been playing RPGs since 95, I believe, starting with Call of Cthulhu. I've then drifted towards Pathfinder 1st edition and have recently, 3 years ago, started playing a 5th edition campaign, Curse of Strahd.
Awesome. Yeah, much more experience than myself, so I'm looking forward to leveraging some of that experience today.
Let's see.
The topic of today is fudging. What does that mean to you?
Well, I'd like to give a nuanced answer, because when you talk about fudging, people tend to take very extremist views. Mm-hmm. Either it's all the rule of cool, and fudging is the way to go, or it's all bad and you should never do it. Mm-hmm. But in my opinion, fudging is pretty much, it's a symptom of something, and when things have come as far as that you need to fudge, then you probably should do it. But what you really should do is look at ways to avoid doing so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's, what is the word? An incendiary topic. Sometimes, as you said, yes. a lot of extreme views on it. And I've touched on it a couple of times in the podcast today, like fudging dice rolls, obviously. All the way back in episode 2, I think, in Ability, I asked Jack then, what's his opinion on a DM doing that. So obviously you and I started talking on Twitter because you've recently done a whole 10-part tweet thread?
7-part, I think.
7-part tweet thread about dice fudging, and as you've just said, describe the symptoms and trying to get to the root cause of, okay, it was almost like, hey, you might have wondered how I've found myself in this position of having to fudge dice, that movie trope,
exactly.
and trying to get to the symptom of, okay, this is what's led you on that path, and this is how you can kind of cut it off much earlier and just save yourself the hassle, which I found really, really interesting, and I'd encourage all the listeners to go out and check Bart's threads on those, because there's a lot of interesting things, and it shouldn't be any surprise to you, Bart, that I didn't agree 100% all the time, but that's why we're talking today. And
yeah, that was interesting, actually.
Yeah, thank you. And but most parts I did, but there are one or few that it's a spice of life, right? Different opinions and different points of view. So
of course.
Before we get into the nitty-gritty of that, then, as I said, Jack mentioned way back when, all the way back through the mists of time in episode 2, he said he feels, as a player, it's okay for the DM to do if it makes sense at the time. And I certainly feel like it's one of those things, as are a lot in D&D, specifically D&D, where context is everything. I think it's so incendiary a question because it's so dependent on context, right? And when you ask that question in isolation, when you ask that question in isolation of just, oh, I've done this, or should I do this? People can't help but be like, oh my God, that's the worst thing you could ever possibly do, because I don't know any of the context or the setting or how big of an impact that will be in your world. So does that broadly align with, I know your thoughts, but let's take it slowly for the time being. Does that broadly align with your thoughts on it?
Well, pretty much. I assume that when both the DM and the players agree that at some point dice roll should be ignored, then there's a good reason to do so. Mm-hmm. So I won't argue with that. But the point I made in my article is that many of those situations can be avoided. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure about the exact context of the situation in question, mm-hmm. but I believe in most cases it can just be avoided altogether. Mm-hmm. But there is a need to fudge. I want to stress that as soon as the DM thinks or assumes the game will be better if they ignore the dice rolls, well, I have nothing against that. Mm-hmm. They probably have a good reason to do so.
Mm-hmm. I have a bit of it's a difficult one for me. I am, as a person, as a human being, quite risk averse. and quite process oriented. So just the chaotic nature of dice rolls are already at a bit of a friction with myself there. One thing that I've wanted to say, and it's one thing you mentioned in one of your threads, was rolling in the open, or rolling publicly, for example. And if you'd have asked me or suggested that of me, maybe a year or so ago, I would have found that almost abhorrent an idea, a blasphemy to the purity of the game, because it removes a tool, essentially, a toolkit.
Yeah.
However, since I've started doing it, it's like a weight has been lifted off my shoulders.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's exactly how I felt as well. I only really started rolling in the open at the start of my Curse of Strahd campaign, and I had the same feeling. I was no longer responsible, or I no longer felt responsible all the time for everyone's fun.
Yeah, that's a really elegant way of putting it. Obviously, like the GM, DM has a large responsibility.
Yeah, that remains, of course, yeah.
Yeah, and all the players have a huge amount of responsibility too, of course. But that is an extra layer on top of, like, I've kind of implicitly been given the power to fudge dice rolls, and it just implies that they are directly correlated to fun. And it doesn't have to be that way, right? It can just be the dice fall where they may. And it was just, as you discussed, like a breath of fresh air almost, like a weight off my shoulders to be like, hey, I don't care. Like, it sounds silly to say I don't care anymore, but that's the only way I can describe it. When I was rolling privately, there's just another layer of maths on top to be like, ooh, is that too much? Is that too little? Do I need to think about it? Is that going to break the game? Whereas now it's like, whatever. They are what they are.
And the most important part is, right now when I'm running the game, I feel like a participant. I'm not a player, obviously, but I can unabashedly root for the players. I wish them success. And they know I'm not out to save them or push the story one way or another, but I'm actually actively rooting for them. And I can do that by just rolling all dice in the open and being obvious about that.
Yeah, it's like a twofold benefit of what you've just described, of being transparent with the players. And I think, despite this tradition of a DM screen, I think transparency is underrated, to be honest. There's always that kind of semi-adversarial DM screen ideology, but I think there's a lot to be said about transparency, and one way you can achieve that is by rolling in the open. And the other half, the other boon I found is, as I mentioned, it's less. It feels like a metagaming less, but of course all the DM does is metagame. The metagame is their game in a certain way, if you put it in a certain way. But I have to worry less. Like, it's less responsibility without losing anything from the game. It's less of, I can control whether that character live or dies, but it's no less fun because of it. And
that's not your burden anymore, or it shouldn't be.
So that was one point, and it's oddly become easier since moving online because of virtual tabletops. It's there, the numbers are on the screen, everybody can see them.
Indeed.
If I roll in the open in a big table with my 6 players, I have, lean in the middle, or I have, only a couple of them will see. It's ever so slightly diluted, but you can't get much more transparent than the GM rolled 1d20. The answer was 15. There you go, guys.
Yeah, true.
But that raises an interesting question, and we're going to talk about not fudging dice, or the results of the numbers on the dice, but obviously if you approach that from a different point of view, and it's difficulty classes or DCs for a certain skill check. So I'm a very improvisational DM. That's a nice way of saying I kind of lead with my intuition. I kind of make a judgment call at the time how hard or easy a particular task should be. And this is going to sound contradictory to the how much I was just gushing over rolling in the open, but obviously that's still very much internalized, right? There isn't a public DC. So do you also advocate having a public DC and saying, like, before the character rolls, hey, or before you roll for the character, hey, this DC is 15?
It kind of depends on the context, I think. But usually, yes, I will say what the armor class is or what the difficulty class is beforehand, because it helps the player imagine just how difficult the task at hand is. It adds to the tension. Now, obviously, I don't do this all the time. For special opponents who have special defenses or something, I don't usually call out the AC. Very tricky skill checks or skill checks where the exact conditions are uncertain, I also play coy about the DC. But usually, yes, I will tell the players that's what you need to roll. And they like it, actually. Well, of course, that's anecdotal because I only have 5 players, so it means nothing, but at least at my table, it's appreciated.
I think for most of those kind of non-critical or non-complicated encounters, 9 times out of 10, my players are paying attention to what hits and misses anyway. So it only takes like 2 rounds of combat and they've worked out what the AC is anyway. Putting things like parry and shield aside, it's pretty easy in a few, maybe even 1 round, depending on how the dice roll. Someone hits a 17, misses, someone hits an 18, it hits, done. Okay, worked out. Anyway.
There's also, I've noticed a strange psychological aspect when the players don't know the DC, at least my table. They keep rolling the dice in their hand for a much longer time. They hold the dice, just try to weigh their options, like, what would the DC be? They don't know. But once you say it's AC 17, okay, it takes 2 seconds to roll the dice. It's a very strange thing.
That is strange. Wow, okay, that's interesting. I hadn't thought of that before. I play a board game called Gloomhaven that I've mentioned at least twice already on the podcast. And it's kind of a cooperative dungeon crawler, and the rules of that when you're playing together is no names and no numbers. So it's everybody's playing with part of the picture because nobody has all the information. The players are playing classes and they have special cards that can do special things, but I can't see what my tankier partner next to me has available to him. So you're all kind of playing on half information, which is where the fun comes from, and the friction and the accidents, the happy accidents and whatnot. So what they say when they may say no names and no numbers is you can allude to your party what you're going to do. I might go there and hit this guy, but I can't tell you when I might do that or how much damage I'm going to do, which again builds into the, do I need to do more? Do I need to do less? How much can I push it? So yeah, it's that no names and no numbers. So you have initiative in that game in a round that the 4 party members can go at a certain time, broadly in the control of the players within some certain rule sets. The initiative goes from 0 to 100. But what that breeds, and it's a bit of a meme in the community, is you've got like mid. I'm going to go in the mid, which means 40 to 60. At some point, like you start inventing this language.
Sure. Yeah.
You start inventing this language, and it gets to the, a silly point of I'm going mid, which is like 49 to 51, right? Like, or I'm going mid late of early. Early is like 0 to 25, so the middle of 0 to 25 is what, like 12. But you start inventing like 4 layers deep of this kind of like, and there's even a meme picture of literally 100 different phrases. Technically you're not saying any numbers, but if you're going early, that's 5. So like you can kind of get around it in that regard. And what I'm getting at is when I'm rolling or judging DCs at the table, I'm often employing a similar strategy of saying you can try, but it will be very difficult. Wink, as in it's DC 30.
Yeah, it's basically the same strategy.
Yeah,
and it works well, I believe. There's nothing wrong with it if you want to keep DCs hidden a bit and save some surprises for later. But when you're just fighting bog standard goblins, I see no trouble in saying, look, they're SC 12, just beat them up and be done with it. It saves time.
Yeah, for sure. Which is, combat is a bit notorious for taking long, as it is anyway.
Exactly. But for special encounters, as you mentioned, yeah, of course, you might want to preserve the mystery a bit.
Yeah, build the tension, build the surprise, build the intrigue, for those bigger set-piece encounters, for sure. But for things which are, I was going to say less important, but that's not right. So out of combat encounters, so say the bard is trying to, the classic example of trying to get a discount at a merchant. It's 5 gold, I'll give you 3 gold for it, roll me persuasion. That is still very much in the DM's fiat of basically setting whatever they want, which is a way of fudging the outcome, right? You're rendering the dice roll useless to a certain extent, because the DM could say 25. I'm having a bad day and I hate this bard, so I'm just going to say he's going to fail no matter what he rolls. What are your thoughts on that? Like the other side of fudging, I suppose.
I think I talked about that, not necessarily the bard example, but I mentioned somewhere that there are also pointless dice rolls, and that GMs might be tempted to fudge those as well. So what I had in mind, for example, the barbarian wants to kick down a door, has strength bonus +3, rolls a 1, rolls again, rolls a 2, rolls a 5, and before long the GM says, okay, you kick down the door. But you can just save time and not roll at all. That's also a form of DM fiat, and I'm going off on a tangent here, hold on. What I wanted to say was there are two kinds of GM fiat, in my opinion. You have the enabling kind, which supports player choice, and you have the negating kind, which blocks it. Now, in the case of the bard's example, if you set the DC extremely high, of course, then you might as well tell him, well, no, this is not going to happen, and save yourselves the time of the roll. That's a negating GM fiat. But you could realistically, of course, set the DC at anything you like, and that would be an enabling GM fiat, but then it would enable more if you told it to the player before rolling. So like you could tell him, okay, this is going to be a DC 25, so it's going to be difficult. Do you want to try? Or do you want to improve your chances by doing something else? Do you want to bribe him? Do you want to threaten him? Whatever. Do you want to improve your chances somehow? And that's an enabling choice, or an enabling choice the player can make.
That's reminding me of something you said earlier on that I wanted to talk about, is that it helps communicate the difficulty to the player. So of course I could wax lyrical to the player. Oh, it's very difficult, but that obviously means that can mean basically nothing to the player. But then once you've set the number, it's really told them this. No, okay, hang on, this is actually pretty difficult. Like, I understand now what the GM is trying to communicate to me.
Exactly, and it really helps build that shared image of the scene for all players present.
Man, that's such a profound boon. And we started this conversation with, oh, well, I've rolled behind the screen. It was a 6. I'll just say it's 12. But it's those kind of things that are just so easily overlooked, the bigger impact that they can have, or the bigger bonuses you can get by not doing them. The other thing I wanted to mention is there's a pretty fundamental rule. I'm pretty sure it's a rule, an official rule, but also it's absolutely a rule of thumb, is that you should never get the players to roll for something trivial or impossible. And that in its own is obvious, but we've just described a couple of examples there just off the top of our heads where people, GMs will still get characters to roll even though it is effectively impossible. So like if that merchant was particularly stingy and the chances slim to none, then you wouldn't have them roll persuasion, because it's just, as you said, wastes time. But that brings me to another interesting point, and it is one you tweeted about, and it's that single point of failure. And this is one of the points that we actually did agree on, and it is a big bugbear of mine because it's just so obvious. Maybe that's just the benefit of being a DM, I'm not sure. But having a roll for a single point of failure is just so immediately obvious to me that the reason it bugs me, rant mode engaged. The reason it bugs me is because it doesn't value my time, right? If there's a single point of failure, so for those listening, what we mean by that is the DM has painted themselves into a corner or has set up some kind of encounter where it all comes down to a single dice roll to move the story forward. So they need the players to see or to notice a clue, like a really critical clue. It's all come down to this one single clue. They're investigating a room, they're searching for it. Okay, roll me investigation. Uh-oh, the player has rolled a 1. And that's what we mean by single point of failure, right? It's they can't, the players are now stuck, essentially. So what does the DM do in that situation? And the reason it bugs me is because as a player, maybe I don't even have to be the one rolling the dice. But what happens in that situation usually is the DM has to scrabble around to say, But maybe you have advantage because you feel good about yourself today because it's Friday. Roll again.
Yeah,
and then
exactly.
that's the life ring they've thrown themselves, which immediately at that point you could already tell that, okay, something's not quite right here. Shock horror, they roll a 2. Well, okay, well, they're still screwed. Maybe John, you roll as well because you were also kind of looking around.
That happens often. Yeah, you were there as well. You take the roll, yeah.
Yeah, and it doesn't value my time because at that point, I know what the outcome is. I know that we're going to find this thing. So why are we still faffing around with rolls?
Well, exactly. And there's 2 ways to handle that. The first is consider it a pointless roll, and you don't roll at all, which is probably the fastest way. But there's another way, and that's actually a great trick I learned from the Alexandrian, which is a blog I assume you're familiar with.
No, please fill me in and my listeners.
Well, it's called The Alexandrian. It's run by Justin Alexander, and he has been writing very, very insightful articles since, I'm not even sure, I think, I don't even dare say, but he's been writing a very long time. Yeah, I think he started with 3.5 Dungeons & Dragons. Anyway, very insightful articles where he discusses common GMing errors, common design errors. And actually, it's his blog which inspired me to write this thread about fudging. And what he mentions there is, among other things, the 3-clue rule. That's an article you should definitely search for.
That's a thing I've heard of, and I think even mentioned before in the podcast. That
I've put it in the link, I think.
Yeah.
In the thread, I mean, yeah. And basically, what you do is if the adventure or the mystery scenario, because it's about mystery scenarios, if the mystery requires a certain realization to be solved, then that realization should be spread around in the scenario among at least 3 clues. So if the players miss the first, misinterpret the second, then they'll probably be able to advance when they find and rightly interpret the third. And that's a robust scenario design. So then you can have players failing their roles or simply making the wrong choices and missing certain clues, but they still have a chance of completing the scenario.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is something do you know what, it might even be on that blog post. It was just months ago and I never put 2 and 2 together. But yeah, that is something I've read that and obviously would absolutely support. And I think it was an example of the example I saw, maybe this is one I even made up, but it was around so the players are investigating a murder or something, so they go to the crime scene and they're trying to find out, do a Sherlock Holmes essentially, find out what the deal is, and perhaps the murderer is the baker's apprentice. So an example of the 3 clues was maybe they find some flour around that has fallen off of his apron, and they might not immediately say flour equals baker equals baker's apprentice, but that's a clue in of itself to start tugging at that thread. Another clue is perhaps there's a delivery note because he used, I'm making a delivery, here's my delivery note that's been left on the floor that gives the address of the baker's. Oh, suddenly I'm starting to put 2 and 2 together and getting a number here. And then the third is maybe, a bassinet, a basket of fresh loaves that he was hiding the sword in, or the dagger in that he used to commit the murder. Yeah,
that's a good example.
Thank you. I kind of half remembered, half made that up on the spot. So thank you.
That's not bad.
I mean, definitely. So I got that credit. I got to credit somebody from in the past, but it's probably misremembered poorly on my part. But thank you nonetheless. But I think the point is that like even one of those is still good. Like with the right team and insightful players, which I imagine you'd have in that kind of setting, even one of those is enough to get them on the right track. But all 3 together, and they feel chuffed that our characters have managed to find 3 clues. That's really good, which just increases that confidence level in, well, it's definitely the bakers then, let's go.
Exactly. And they get this sense of reward because if you just use your GM fiat to say, you found the clue, you found the bloody glove, you can go ahead, the scenario continues and it's decent design, I won't argue that, but it's not as rewarding as the players finding 1, 2 or 3 clues by themselves.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually. Yeah, for expedience, or, if you're improvising hard, then I would not, criticize anybody for doing you found the clue without rolling.
Of course
because
not.
That's, in those dire situations, I know as a DM, like in those dire situations, you're willing to throw anything at the wall just to make it look like, keep those plates spinning. But obviously in a pre-planned thing, yeah, absolutely, you roll it through. But what I guess is a follow-up to that would be might want to vary the difficulty on those. So maybe the likelihood of finding one is quite high, a scaling difficulty. The middle one is maybe 50-50, and then the third clue is maybe, a 25% chance of finding it, just to obviously increase the likelihood of something happening. But it's all set up ahead of time. You roll in the open, transparency, reward, plus, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, I could rant about that single point of failure all day, because I just have to cringe whenever
Everyone's experienced a single point of failure.
Yeah.
Everyone's had that.
Yeah. And another thing I wanted to mention earlier on about how I started rolling in the open is something that I I absolutely didn't think about until it hit me, was there are items in D&D 5e that have random elements to them that aren't even necessarily dice tables. So there are things like Helmet of Brilliance and Necklace of Prayer Beads, which have 1d6 gems in them. And I planned on giving both of those items to my players.
Mm-hmm.
And immediately I went to my GM friend, confidant, and said, this is a crutch. This is a failure on my point that I didn't just roll. But I said to him, oh God, what if they get all 6 gems, and what if it's just 1 gem, and oh no. And I was absolutely falling foul of what we were discussing earlier on. I was metagaming, making more work for myself when I didn't really need to. So in the end, I got my dice tower, got my phone, and recorded the dice rolling. So I sent it to the player and said, look, there's all your, I rolled for the number of gems, and then you roll, then there is a dice table for what the gems correspond to, what spells they have. So I ended up rolling 5 d20s at once, recorded it on WhatsApp, sent them the video and said, there you go, 17, 14, 7 and 6. Nice. That means you've got this spell, this spell, this spell, and this spell. And then it was actually quite a good discussion with him then, because I was like, hey, you've actually been pretty lucky. This is cool. I'm happy for you because you've got a couple of decent spells here. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, precisely. So I was quite happy. I was like, hey, law of averages means, inevitably it was going to be pretty middle of the road anyway. And I needn't have feared the worst case scenario of what if he gets 1 million wishes, which is impossible, but it's, it's that level of fear, which, needn't happen. And that was a big step for me to be like, because it's, it's taken it out of my control to a certain extent, and I am quite particular with my story, shall we say.
Yeah, I understand. That's normal, I think. I've had to learn abandoning that sense of control as well.
I wonder where that comes from then. I think the fact that you and I have had it and talk about it, and there's articles about it, and you're tweeting all about it, that essentially it's that abandonment of control from the GM's perspective. Where is that born from? That preciousness of control. I'm now thinking out loud here, but that's...
I think it's because, everything, all the commercial modules are about telling a story.
Mm.
And if you want to play that module, you need to follow the story. And usually they're pretty much a big railroad. Curse of Strahd is a notable exception, and I believe Tomb of Annihilation as well. I'm not really sure.
Mm-hmm.
But many modules, especially the Pathfinder First Edition, the many modules they made for that were usually railroads starting in the inn, and you go to the Goblin's Lair, and from there on you go to the Wizard's Tower, and so on. And you need to retain control, or the players go off track. Mm-hmm. But that's not necessarily a problem as far as I'm concerned. I've had to learn letting go of that idea. And when the players went off track, just say, okay, you abandon the railroad, mm-hmm. and we'll use a different module, or we'll use some homebrew content to flesh out where you're going next. And that's actually, it makes for a more, realistic isn't the right word, it's more fun. That's something I can definitely say. I found it more fun.
So one thing you mentioned in your talk on fudging dice is your tools, not rules policy. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, tools, not rules means basically all these GM or DM techniques you read about online, because there are many, many techniques floating about. None of them in themselves help you be a better DM. They're just things you should consider, at least, and then learn to adapt them to your own games. Because even the information I put in my threads, like always roll in the open or roll in the open as much as possible, that might not work in your own campaign. So what you want to do is you want to take that advice, use it a little at first, perhaps some more later, see what works. And in the end, the goal is just to have more fun at the table. That's it. That's all there is to it.
Yeah, I very much see myself as a GM as having a toolkit. I think I mentioned it earlier on, like a tool belt that as I'm playing, I can pull out a tool and apply it in some way, or even, not even during the game, just in campaign prep and story, world building and stuff. You can, let me think about it in that way, and let me think about what 3 clues to put here, or maybe it needs 5, or maybe it doesn't need any. And that thought process there of what is good for this particular context is everything, right? It's
exactly, that's what I was trying to say. Context is everything, really.
One thing you mentioned, we talked about earlier, and you mentioned in your threads, was dice tables, so random tables. And I know some of the magical items I mentioned do, but the more primary way of dice tables is either encounters or treasure, or I feel like I'm missing one. Combat encounters or road encounters, treasure.
Wild magic was an example I used.
Yes, yeah.
Reincarnation tables.
Oh, because you come back as a different race.
Yes,
right?
For example. So yeah, is that fudging?
Well, to me, yes. I mean, it was when I read that, I thought to myself, wow, that's weird that someone would fudge those dice rolls, because the whole reason you've got those tables is because you don't know what you're doing, or you want it to be decided for you. So then to change that means you've already decided what you want to happen. So it was this weird kind of counter-intuitive, you've answered your own question. It's
where things get fuzzy, in my opinion, as well. I believe what I wrote in the thread was, because I've been thinking about it for quite some time before writing that, of course. The way I saw it was these random tables. Basically, there's 2 types to me. You have the creative ones, which are actually the GM delegating their fiat to a table. So as you mentioned, they say, well, I don't know what's going to happen, I'm going to roll on the table. So they're purely creative. And then you have some which are purely mechanical. For example, the weird magic Fallout table, or what's it called. The purely creative ones, for me, they're the enabling kind of DM fiat. It doesn't really matter whether you roll or choose. So if you're using a random dungeon generator table to see what's around the next corner, whether you roll a corridor or a room, or you choose either of those, it doesn't really matter. The players still have the same choice. Do we go there or not? And then you have the purely mechanical ones. So like the wild magic, I keep forgetting the name.
Yeah,
I always want to say weird magic. The wild magic, those are actually the result also of a player's choice. Because the player factors in every single effect that can happen as a result of their choice. So they want to cast wild magic, then they accepted whatever can happen. So I wouldn't fudge those, because you're affecting the result of a choice. But then there's these weird in-between situations, like Wandering Monsters. Because Wandering Monsters, on one hand, they're creative, because they help shape the environment, they help set a certain theme, but they also have a mechanical component. So, and that's a difficult one, and I believe I wrote there that as a GM you should consider why you want to fudge that. Do you want to fudge it because it's a bad fit? I mean, is it a white dragon in the middle of the desert? Well, perhaps you can fudge and choose something else simply. Or is it because you want to change something mechanically? You want to up the challenge, you want to decrease the challenge. In the latter case, perhaps not fudge. In the former, I like to give myself a couple of seconds to see if I can't come up with some creative reason to accept the result anyway.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, like most GMs, I want to keep the game flowing, so if I can't come up with something in 3 to 5 seconds, I choose something else. So the first, not really fudging, I can accept that. It's player choice enabling. The second, it's fudging.
There's a lot to unpack there. Man, it's tricky. It's a tricky topic, and you can see why it spawns so much discussion of.
Absolutely.
It almost feels like that Wizards of the Coast have just like deliberately not referencing the elephant in the room, like deliberately distancing themselves and just being like, la 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 la, we're not going to think about too much about this thing because it's just going to be a very interesting discussion.
It's possible, but I have the impression that Wizards of the Coast and actually most publishers, they are for fudging. I have this impression that this may be wrong, but I think they advocate fudging because it helps new DMs, and that's actually a very good reason to fudge. If you're just getting your feet wet, and well, when I started out, I made lots of mistakes, and I'm sure everyone did, then it's better to fudge than let the game grind down to a halt. So it helps GMs gain a bit of confidence, I think, and not make mistakes, party killers or campaign killers. Just helps to move the game along.
It's one of those things though that can be a crutch, or you pick it up in your formative years, and then it becomes part of your staple of.
That's
well, it worked
danger.
then, so it works now, and then 10 years later you're still doing it. But even though you don't need to anymore because you're actually a darn fantastic GM at this point, so you could probably do it without it. But it's just built into you at that point because it worked 10 years ago when I was learning. So I guess it's a good thing to do.
Of course, and it's an easy fix.
That's a good point, because one of my notes here, I was trying to put it off for a little while, but the about maybe where we just disagree somewhat, or maybe not disagree is too strong a word, but have different thoughts on is at low levels. But now here's my problem. Here's what I'm trying to untangle. Is it actually at low levels, as in character levels, or is actually my experience at the time was I didn't have, I was a low level DM at the time, and it's just because the correlation there is 1-to-1. They were the characters at low level, and I'd also just started DMing. That it's easy to conflate the two, but in reality, I didn't use fudging the dice because they were low levels. I was actually using it because I didn't know any better, and that you can get around those TPKers with a little bit of thought and experience. I'm kind of convincing myself of that answer now, but what are your thoughts on the
early level life support, you mean?
Yeah.
That's expectation management. I think that depends on the kind of game you want to run. I personally like a bit of danger and lethality in my games. So when my players set out in Curse of Strahd, they started out on level 1. And I told them, well, I'm going to roll in public on the table. If you're dead, you're dead. So that was setting the expectations already. I think we lost one player in the meantime. But of course, if the kind of story or the campaign you want to run is something which really starts to unfold at just saying level 2, 3, or you want to first give the players their bearings a bit, I can understand that you want to have some life support in the form of fudging. So I understand that, but I still think that there are, well, as a DM, there are different ways to have that life support in place without fudging the dice. But of course, it's much trickier because the margin of error is so much smaller.
Yes. Yeah, you're on the razor's edge there for a lot of those earlier levels.
Because just one mistake, one critical hit by a bugbear and they're gone.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that is... Because that's exactly the thought I had earlier on when I was thinking about this episode, was that people fudge the dice because it's so swingy. I always say, the first few levels are super swingy, and that usually smooths out as you get into tier 2. That is much less swingy, or there's a lot more margin for error, shall we say. Revivify, cure wounds, potions, all that kind of stuff is there
exactly.
to smooth out that swinginess. But it is swingy at low levels. Do you think that is a failing of the framework? Do you think that's a failing of the rules, or is that almost a necessary evil?
That's a tough question, I think. A failing of the rules? No, not necessarily. I suppose I really haven't looked at it that way. Because one thing I talked about in the threads was that for combat encounters, it's... And I blame video games for this. Like an old man, I blame video games. That many GMs set the stakes for combat encounters at death. Goblins come from the woods, and they want to kill you.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're not prepared to accept a player death as a result of such an encounter, then you shouldn't set the stakes at player death. Because you control not only which encounters they have, but also the motives of those characters. So if combat and swingy combat is the problem at early levels, my suggestion would be to change the stakes, simply put.
Mm-hmm.
So stop putting the players or stop putting the characters in situations where only death is a probable outcome of either party.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I did in Curse of Strahd, I think, because they recommend you start at 3rd level. But as I mentioned before, I didn't do that. But I simply didn't have everyone out to kill the PCs at first sight. And that's helped a lot.
Is that, from your experience and knowledge, are most of the published modules that are released, are they their first encounters? Let's take Lost Mines of Vandelver, I think. I seem to recall the first combat in that is quite kill or be killed.
I don't remember that one. I have it here, but I haven't played it yet, so...
What about any others that you have experience with? Are they those kind of first early encounters in the game, are they often that kill or be killed, or are there other avenues out from your experience?
Well, from what I can recall, most published modules, an encounter is kill or be killed.
Mm.
That happens a lot.
So, although it might not be a failing of the system or the rules or the frameworks, does that not suggest that the published modules encourage those failings in a way, like emphasize those issues in the fact that it's kill or be killed at those low levels?
I would say yes. They compound the problem a little.
That's the word I was looking for. Yeah, compound the problem. Yeah, precisely. It's an interesting one. I kind of regret opening this little can of worms now. Like, as we bring we're nearing the end of the episode, and yeah, it's one I hadn't really thought of too much. I know that I have fudged dice in the past. Dice actually less so. More often than not, I'm fudging HP is my main creature HP, which is twofold. One, because I hate maths and my characters are level 8, soon to be 9 now, and combat is quite complicated. With lots
I can imagine,
lots of enemies, lots of numbers flying around. I really don't have it in my mental space at the time, along with doing all the flavour and environmental effects and so on and so on, to really... I haven't got a good system yet for really managing all the HP. So sometimes I round, a character says they hit for 24. I'm like, okay, that's 20.
Yeah, okay.
With my mental reasoning behind that is that broadly over enough sessions, it will all kind of even out. Balance out.
Makes sense.
Yeah. Flip enough coins and it'll be 50-50 is my mentality behind, today it's 24 to 20, but tomorrow it's, 16 to 20. So it should go, but I know that is a get out of jail free on my part. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think your way is consistent. So I think your logic is sound. If you do that all the time, then it will even out. And by the way, it's important to keep the game flowing. Mm-hmm. So if that helps you keep the game flowing, that's a win for me. So is that fudging? Not really, because you're not constantly pushing the encounter to go one way or the other. You're just rounding up or rounding down to make things move along smoothly. So that's fine in my book. And my players are only level 5 at the moment, so I haven't encountered the same problem before. But I have thought about it, and the thing I plan on doing is just giving my players notepads or dice or whatever, and tell them to keep track of their hit points for me.
Of the creatures?
Of the creatures.
Oh, wow.
It also gives them some sense of achievement. It gives them something to do at the table, less distractions, less using the phone and all that. Mm-hmm. And the hit points don't need to be a secret for me.
Yeah, that is bold. Okay, here we go. 50 minutes in, and we're at the big juicy boys. Here we go.
What you could do is also count the other way around. Just have the characters add up the hit points instead of subtracting from the total. And then they won't know the total hit points until you say, well, he's dead.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that might be the concession that I would make if I was to introduce this, which I might well do.
It moves the game along.
Mm-hmm. From one of the other episodes, enhancements, we talked about delegating tasks to players. So that's actually something that's literally something I've now done. I had that discussion with Christian, and since then I've actually adopted that with my players. So now I've got one player who's like the note taker, one player who is tracking magical items for the party, and one is doing buffs and debuffs. So it's not too much of a stretch to say, okay, I need another one of you guys. Like I got 6 of them, so there's enough of them to go around to say, one of you're counting HP for the or damage, should I say.
Why not?
Interesting, I say, rubbing my hands together. That's, that will be a huge weight off of my mind. Again, mainly just for the expedience, just because every time there's damage done by the players, which is a lot, I have to go, stop, let me count and do a number and this, that, and the other. Whereas you could just flip that around to maybe 1 or 2 players. You could split it to say,
you do the ghouls, you do the skeletons, something like that.
Yeah, precisely, yeah. And every time it gets damaged, you just tell me what the number is. Yeah. And then that you've completely mitigated metagaming. Some people aren't going to like that, I think, because it takes away some of the not even the mystery, but it takes away some of the romance of that question of, well, how is he looking? Oh, he's looking beat up and he's on his last legs. It gives them a little bit more, but again, it's that context is everything, right? If your players aren't in it for the romance,
it might not be for everyone. Mm-hmm. But I think, it saves time at the table, and it frees up your brain power to go with the cool descriptions and keep the flow of combat going. So for me, it's a small price to pay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I am quite a fan of. I think it was an Angry DM post that talked about a flow of combat is like a dolphin, like swimming. You come up over the water, you break the water, you dive underneath. You come up, you dive underneath. So it's that when you stitch the turns together, you describe, okay, John, you've just seen your party member James be slashed across his face with this. What are you doing? And then you duck back underneath, and then when you come back out again, you keep it going. And I'd much rather focus on that than I would, let me get my Excel spreadsheet and mark off this, and hang on, let me open the VTT, and what's 17 minus 12 is this, okay, enter. Like
it breaks up the flow. And also, I think players will love doing that. I mean, I can name 2 players at my table who love keeping track of their kills. So they'll love keeping track of hit points as well.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about a way that's doable with my current virtual tabletop setup as well, in terms of counting up rather than counting down, and have the same effect. So in the virtual tabletop I use, monsters, their health isn't displayed on them. They have a bit, again, funnily enough, a bit like the Gloomhaven descriptor of initiative. They have a injured, barely injured, heavily injured, wounded, and it's a percentage of their HP total. But I could flip the maths on its head, and it would I would count up. It would go 10% is not hurt, and obviously 90% of HP is heavily wounded. So that could still work. You could still do it. That's on my notes. That's on my notes for opening next session to say this is what we're going to try. But to put a nice bow in it, as we've said a couple of times, it's that case of, as you said, try it out. Try it a couple of times. Maybe it sticks, maybe it doesn't. But without at least trying, you'll never know.
Yeah, and make a few tweaks if necessary.
Mm-hmm.
But just find out what works best in your group.
Mm-hmm.
I've also tried out many things. I have this homebrew Pathfinder campaign, and that's really, it was my playground for trying out new things, new structures. And, well, I don't think 50% of things I tried really took, but those that did improved the game. So it's just trying, see what works, throwing stuff at the wall and see what sticks.
Which makes it worthwhile. The ones that have improved the game, that's a net benefit there for little to no cost. So absolutely try and have a look at these systemic problems that are causing you to maybe fudge dice. I'm now trying to leverage us back on the railroad
On track.
to look at those lower level problems that are maybe leading you down the garden path of what's another. After all, why shouldn't I fudge another dice here? That mentality is often can be an inhibitor. But to give an example, funny anecdote of how swingy combat is I took a friend, Jamie, who's been in a couple of episodes before, through his first D&D experience. It was one-on-one. I was his DM, and the combat. Obviously, it's a known fact that obviously combat we've discussed is swingy, and it really breaks down basically with 2 characters, and then past 7 characters. I think Wizards themselves have said the system isn't designed for that many or that few. That's not a secret. That's just that's the limits of the maths, right? It's something's got to give somewhere. Yeah. So I think he was even level 1. I might have said level 2 at that point, but it was one player character level 2. And I wanted him to get a taste of rolling dice and, having combat in quotes. And the best thing I could come up with was, I think he fought 3 cats or something in a field, in a meadow. CR0 cats, 5 HP, plus 0 to hit, 1d4 slashing damage. And that was what was maybe balanced for that. And even that was he could die, but it just makes me smile because of how absurd it is. He's still an adventurer. He's still someone who's better than the average person. He even still could die to some house cats.
Well, yeah, I agree. Those are the limits of the system, I think.
Yeah. That was a real bleeding edge of stretching it as much as it will go. I know we've talked about an awful lot and all sorts of weird and wonderful bits and bobs, but I wanted to finish on, from my perspective, of a lot of the times you find yourself asking the question of, should I fudge here? Or let's just say that was actually another number, often because of other reasons that might not be obvious. I think that was probably my biggest takeaway from your threads and the discussion today is there's a system in I'm going to get my business head on for a second, in quality control and quality management in organizations and production environments, of the 5 whys.
Yeah, I'm familiar with it.
Yeah, when a problem has been identified, you were late to ship a product, you ask, why were we late? Because we didn't get it into the storehouse in time. Okay, well, why didn't you get it into the storehouse in time? Oh, because the car broke down. Well, why did the car break down? Oh, because we didn't take it for its service. Why didn't we take it for its service? And you keep asking why. And when you hit 5 times, that is the actual thing you need to fix. And I think a similar thing can be applied to, why am I in a position where I'm having to fudge this dice?
Absolutely. That's actually a very good remark.
Thank you. So to try and make an example up on the spot, it's say you're in that position of, okay, I've just rolled a natural 20 and it's going to kill this player character. Well, why are they in a situation where that's happened? If you're not being transparent, and it's a big enough a deal at that point that it isn't just the players have done something ridiculously stupid that, you know, to tangent again is I recorded a really good episode on player agency with Scott, optional rule, and he is a big proponent of like the dice dictate the outcome, but the players have had agency up until that point, and that mirrors what we were talking about earlier on, that like the dice aren't taking away agency. That's the decisions they've made up until that point, right? If they've decided to go into a fight naked on 2 HP, then yeah, they're gonna die, and no amount of fudging is gonna get them out of that position. So it's that 5 whys of, oh, okay, but why have they found themselves? And if if the answer is because they've made some foolish decisions as player characters, then
you shouldn't fudge.
Exactly. That's the nature of the game, right? You're trying to put a band-aid on foolishness. But say it's no, they've made the right decisions, but it's a crit because it's actually a 19, but this creature crits on a 19. But then why have we got that creature in? Oh, because it fit the environment. But then you can just get to you're probably better at articulating it than I am. But basically, there's probably an obfuscated reason why you found yourself in that situation.
Yeah, I think also one of the main reasons is, and we've discussed this a bit earlier, is that many encounters default to combat. So you roll a random encounter, some goblins jump from the bush and they attack you. Well, the players have had no choice in that. So killing them in such an encounter feels unfair to everyone at the table, and you feel inclined to fudge. If, on the other hand, the goblins jump from the bush and they demand the characters surrender their gold, or they kill them, well, that's a choice.
Again, a very context-sensitive choice based on your particular makeup of your party.
Yeah, true, but they can surrender their gold, or
the option's there.
They can buy some time. They don't need to do that, but by not defaulting to combat and starting or picking up the thread of the game just before that, players can start angling for a better position. They can start a distraction. So it goes deeper than that. And then if it all boils down to player choice, well, if they made those choices that lead to that combat, which leads to their death, I wouldn't be inclined to fudge.
But again, the 5 whys in that situation is maybe they've made that choice. Say for example, it's not goblins. Say if it's some archdemon, for example.
Big difference, yeah.
It's It's okay. This hit from the archdemon is going to kill this player. Why is he going to do that? Because he's super strong. Okay, why is he super strong? Because he's an archdemon. Okay, well then, why is he fighting the players? Because the players have acted aggressively towards him. Okay, well, why did they act aggressively towards him? That is the root problem there. And in this example, maybe it's because the GM didn't foreshadow it enough to say, like, this guy will kick your ass if you fight him.
Yeah, exactly.
So the player's misconception there was, we can take him, and then now you've painted yourself into a corner of, okay, well, either they die, or I have to really pull his punches, making him weaker than he actually is, which is kind of deflating. Or you've given yourself a lot more work to do some other non-combat alternative, imprisonment, which is iffy, or
that's
something
very
else.
iffy.
Yeah, exactly. So it's you keep asking why, and it's because whoops, I had him stub his toe when he met the players, and the players thought that was funny and stupid, and they thought they could take him, when in reality, no, he commands hordes of demons who will tear you to shreds. So
yeah.
Is there anything else you wanted to talk about?
No, I think we've covered all the fudging articles, so I'm happy.
It's been a whistle-stop tour of a lot of like heavy-ish and weighted topics. I think there's a lot here to unpack that I don't think either, we could do in an hour, or even, your 7 threads were fantastic, but even then it's, we found new things to talk about and stuff. Like, it's just a brilliant, I love it because it's a crystalline example of something that seems benign, but in reality really isn't.
In the long run, it isn't. I still think that in your example of the Archdemon, well, perhaps at the point you should fudge to save the players, and those 5 whys are something you ask yourself after. And you take that to your next encounter and you don't make the same mistake.
Yeah, precisely. Sorry, I didn't mean to imply that, like, you whip out your your quality health and safety manual in the middle of combat to
No.
start doing like a fishbone diagram.
I assumed as much, but for the listeners.
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, thank you for clarifying that. Yeah, for sure. Cool. Okay, well, what a interesting roller coaster, swingy in of itself discussion on dice rolls and methodologies and politics and personality types and all sorts of weird and wonderful stuff that gets bundled into this discussion. So thank you very much, Bart.
Thanks for having me.
Is there anything you would like to plug?
Let's see. I'm currently lucky enough to be involved in a few exciting projects. Most notably, it's the Terminator RPG, which is now on Kickstarter, which you might want to check out. I did just a very, very small part of that. I designed the hacking rules, but that's about it. Mm-hmm. Another thing I've been working on is the Gaia Complex, which is a cyberpunk role-playing game by Hansa Publishing. That's also worth checking out. It's got vampires and cyberpunk, so that's a winning combination in my opinion. Mm-hmm. And I do most of my work for Raging Swamp Press. I have some new adventures coming out soon, I think next month. And finally, you can find me on Twitter as @Cryptographer. And I post daily inspirational stuff or GM advice or just things I like.
All sorts. Yeah, absolutely. All the links will be in the episode description to everything we've discussed today, including those awesome sounding projects. Yeah, you had me at vampires and cyberpunk, as they say.
Excellent.
Otherwise, thank you again, Bart.
Yeah, again, thanks for having me.
That's all right. Thank you, everyone, to listening at home. As usual, please reach out on all the socials available on the websites. Otherwise, thank you all for listening, and good night.